The Metis Nation as a people evolved out of the initial relations of Indian women and European men on the lands of West Central North America. While the initial offspring of these relations were individuals who possessed mixed Indian and European ancestry, the gradual establishment of distinct Métis communities outside of Indian and European traditions, cultures, and settlements, as well as the subsequent intermarriages, resulted in the genesis of a new indigenous peoples, the Métis, with their own unique culture, traditions, language, way of life, collective consciousness, and nationhood. Indeed, the Métis were trailblazers. They helped settle Canada's West by working the lands, establishing a homeland, and building Métis economic activity during the fur trade of the Western Interior. Cuthbert Grant is remembered as one of the first leaders who helped to lead the charge for the rights of the Métis Nation. At the Battle of Seven Oaks in 1816, it was a defining moment in time. In victory, the Infinity flag was raised in recognition of the dawning of a new nation of people. As time evolved, distinct Métis communities developed along the routes of the fur trade and across the Northwest within what is known today as the Métis Nation homeland, which includes the three prairie provinces, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, as well as parts of Ontario, British Columbia, the Northwest Territories, and the northern United States. Métis were the first Indigenous people to form democratically elected governments and organizations, which helped to shape the early political history of a growing nation. It began with the first Métis provisional government led by Louis Riel in Red River, 1869-70, which negotiated the admission of Manitoba into Confederation, and Riel's second provisional government in Saskatchewan, 1885. However, the defeat of the Métis at the Battle of Batoche in 1885 resulted in the arrest and eventual hanging of leader Louis Riel for treason. This drove the Métis movement underground, only to resurface during the Depression, with new Métis associations on the prairies. Today, many of these historic Métis communities continue to exist along rivers and lakes, where forts and posts were once hubs of fur trade activity from Ontario westward. As well, large numbers of Métis citizens now live in major centers within the Métis Nation homeland. However, even with these large urban settings, well-defined Métis communities exist. The Statistics Canada 2011 census reported over 450,000 people self-identified as Métis, resulting in the formation of the largest Indigenous nation in Canada, with nearly 90% located in the western provinces and Ontario. Since the death of Louis Riel, the Métis have acted collectively to pursue his mission of self-government within the Canadian Federation. Despite their efforts, for years, Métis have been treated as a political hot potato, in that neither the provinces nor the federal government wanted to take responsibility for dealing with them. During the Trudeau era, Harry Daniels emerged as the champion of Métis nationalism.
What we are talking about is the equality of people here. And to use your phrase, we're talking about a just society. It can't be just for some Aboriginal people and not for others.
His efforts began to bear fruit when he succeeded with having Métis recognized as one of the three Aboriginal peoples of Canada in the soon-to-be patriated Constitution in January 1981. At the same time, the Manitoba Métis under John Morrisseau launched a land claims lawsuit against the federal government over its failure to provide land for the Métis under the terms of the Manitoba Act of 1870. As time evolved, Harry Daniels' monumental achievement was soon called into question when the Métis were denied representation at the first Constitutional Conference on Aboriginal Rights. Two leaders of the Saskatchewan Métis, Jim Sinclair and Clément Chartier, emerged to lead a new national movement, the Métis National Council. Founded on March 8, 1983, the MNC took Trudeau to court to secure seats for the Métis at the constitutional table. Trudeau backed off, and the Métis were seated.
I'm not here to justify why we're in the Constitution. That seems what everyone tries to ask us, to justify why we're there. We are there, we're an Aboriginal people. Now we will sit down and deal with the rights of Aboriginal people.
The MNC represented the Métis at the Charlottetown Constitutional Talks, which resulted in the drafting and adoption in principle of the Métis Nation Accord. Despite the breakthrough, the Charlottetown Accord, which included the Métis Nation Accord, was defeated in a national referendum in 1992. It was a disappointing setback for the Métis Nation. The MNC works with the federal government to further the Métis agenda across the homeland. Examples include the signing of successive accords to offer employment and training to the Métis Nation through the MNC's provincial affiliates or governing members, which include the Métis Nation of Ontario, the Manitoba Métis Federation, the Métis Nation Saskatchewan, the Métis Nation of Alberta, and the Métis Nation, British Columbia. The definition of a Métis person as adopted by the Métis Nation is someone who self-identifies as Métis, is distinct from other Indigenous peoples, is of historic Métis Nation ancestry, and who is accepted by the Métis Nation. In September 2003, the Supreme Court of Canada ruled unanimously that as Métis people and members of a Métis community, the Powelli's right to hunt was protected by Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. 2013 marked the historic decision of the Supreme Court of Canada in Manitoba Métis Federation versus Canada, in which the court ruled that the federal government had failed to implement the Manitoba Land Grant provision in the Manitoba Act 1870 in accordance with the Honour of the Crown. The decision established a path forward to resolve the Métis' 146-year-old land claim under the Manitoba Act, in which the federal government at the time had promised to set aside 5,565 square kilometers of land for 7,000 children of the Red River Métis, a promise that was never fulfilled. On April 14, 2016, the debate over jurisdiction was finally put to rest when the Supreme Court of Canada, in Daniels versus Canada, affirmed that Canada has a constitutional and jurisdictional responsibility to deal with the Métis Nation and its peoples, with roots stemming from the historic Métis Nation homeland. On November 15, 2016, the Federal Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs and the President of the Manitoba Métis Federation signed a framework agreement to begin the negotiation of land claims agreement to settle the historic claim of the Red River Métis that was upheld by the Supreme Court of Canada. The Canada-MMF Framework Agreement was just one example of the significant progress being made with the Liberal government of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau that is committed to advancing reconciliation with the Métis people and a nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationship. His government entered into exploratory discussions with the MNC's governing members to establish a framework to address Métis rights protected by Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982 to support Métis self-government and resolve outstanding Métis claims against the Crown. These talks are expected to progress to framework agreements that will enable the Métis Nation to negotiate self-government and resolve historic claims. These talks will be supported by a long-awaited report called A Matter of National and Constitutional Import, released on July 21, 2016 by a ministerial special representative to the Federal Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs. Lawyer Tom Isaac was asked to study Métis inherent rights under Section 35 and fulfilling the Government of Canada's commitments under the Manitoba Métis land claim. His report, which was well received by Métis governing bodies, called for a fundamental change in the way the federal and provincial governments deal with and respect Métis as Section 35 rights holders. In December 2016, at a meeting with the leadership of the Métis Nation, the Assembly of First Nations, and the Inuit, the Prime Minister unveiled a new permanent bilateral mechanism his government would establish with each of the Indigenous peoples' national representative bodies. Through this mechanism, the Prime Minister has committed himself and his ministers to regular meetings with the Métis Nation leadership to jointly set annual priorities, develop policies toward their implementation, and monitor progress. On April 13, 2017, Prime Minister Trudeau, Métis Nation President Chartier, and the presidents of the MNC governing members signed the Canada Métis Nation Accord during the first Métis Nation Crown Summit in Ottawa. The accord marks a significant step towards a renewed nation-to-nation, government-to-government relationship based on recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. It outlines the ways in which the Government of Canada and the Métis National Council and its governing members will work together to set priorities and develop policy in areas of shared interest. Under the Accord, priorities for the first year will be employment and training, education, early learning and childcare, housing, health, and new fiscal relations. This accord is the first step in a process that'll help to advance the interests and rights of the citizens of the Metis Nation. Finally, after decades of struggle, sweat and tears, and those who have paid the ultimate price, Metis are feeling that the winds of change are definitely blowing in their favor, and that it's time to move on. It's time to reflect upon the hopes and aspirations of ancestors who have worked the land and fought so hard for the greater good of the Metis Nation.